Finance and Facilities Committee meeting for the school district, can we start over? For the school district of Waukesha. Today is April 12th, 2024. Darren, can you verify that the meeting has been properly posted?
Yes, it is.
All right, we are at the point of the meeting that there's an opportunity for public comment. Do we have any speakers?
No, we don't.
Okay. Moving on, we are into our action items. The first action item is the approval of minutes. Any questions, changes? Otherwise, I'd be looking for a motion to approve.
So moved. Second.
It has been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. All right. Passes 5-0. Next, we are moving into the approval of the vouchers. Darren, did we have any questions this month?
No, unless you forward them to Heather today, then we can get back to you on any that may have been forwarded to her email, but she didn't forward anything to me, so I'm assuming not.
Okay. Be looking for a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second. All right. Approved by Mr. Wad, seconded by Dr. Piasek. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. All right, passes 5-0. The next action item is the approval of the 2024-2025 preliminary budget and tax levy. Mr. Clark.
Yeah, per our budget building calendar each year, we approve our budget and levy to be forwarded on to the budget hearing, which will be held on September 11th prior to the board meeting. So tonight we're asking for approval of the preliminary budget. I have built in a tax levy scenario into the budget, but I also shared with you the tax scenarios, which I shared a couple of weeks ago. We really need to fine tune where do we want to come in with that number. And we can approve the budget tonight with a levy increase of X, and then I'll go in and tweak any budget line items we either need to adjust or not. So there's a little to-do list with the approval tonight. So I put together a slide deck that I thought we'd walk through just to, kind of go over the key components of the preliminary budget. And again, I also have in here the budget calendars attached in board docs. We'll be back in late October with final aid numbers, the results of the third Friday pupil count, and the final EAV number, assessed valuation numbers for the tax rate. So every budget presentation I give, it seems I start off with enrollment, and we are predicting another drop in enrollment of 2% for a third Friday pupil count in September. The other things that go into the revenue limit calculation is each student funding is at $325 increase, so we'll be moving to $11,325 for fiscal year 24-25. We're projecting a 15% increase in the voucher programs. The reason this is important, and people might not think it applies to us, is we actually levy for the dollars, and then we're sent a bill by DPI to cover the costs associated with the voucher programs, and they have been growing at a pretty steady clip. As I mentioned, the September count, we're looking at a 2% drop from the previous year. The revenue limit has a 3-year rolling average to kind of soften the impact of declining enrollment. So if you look at it in terms of the 3-year rolling average, we're looking at a reduction of 184 resident students. The budget, as drafted, is in full compliance with state revenue limit legislation. Fund 10 revenue is set to decrease by $4.4 million, or 2.66%. Fund 10 expenditures, a decrease of $12.1 million, or nearly 7%. And this is all due to ESSER. ESSER is now fading out. Just like we had big jumps in revenue and expenditures a few years ago because of ESSER. We closed out ESSER, or nearly closed out ESSER at the end of fiscal year 23-24. All approved employee compensation and benefit plans are incorporated in this. The special education budget is set to increase by nearly 8%. I've built in the continuance of a lower level of defeasance for our long-term debt. This is one of the things we can talk about with the tax levy, and where we want to go with that in terms of the preliminary budget. Something a little different, Fund 38 and Fund 43 are no longer part of our budget document. Fund 38 was non-referendum approved debt related to some energy efficiency projects, I believe, that the district entered into in 2014. And Fund 43 was where we tracked the proceeds and related expenditures with the 2018 referendum. And there's no funds in either fund, and they're no longer part of our 2-year financial activity look-back period that's incorporated into our budget, so they just simply fall off. Fund 41, you'll notice that there's quite a spend down. If last fall the board approved what we called Phase 3 of the capital improvement project, which is the south bleachers, the south HVAC for the field house, the auditorium improvements, chillers at west, and probably some other things that aren't coming to me at this second. Not all those, this is always the hardest thing because these capital improvement projects cross fiscal years. June 30th is right in the heart of construction season, so last year we levied the funds into Fund 41 to make these things happen, and now we've paid out, what has been completed as of June 30th. And some of that work will actually roll into next summer as well. So this is a planned spend down of fund balance in Fund 41. In comparison, it's often common to look at the prior year, and there's a lot of things that we did in 23-24 that we are not doing in 24-25, so it's hard to compare. It's not quite apples to apples, I guess. Last year we paid one-time stipends to staff. There was the second year of doing that, and it was one of the moves we made to offset the impact of the inflation we've been fighting the last few years. I mentioned the Phase 3 projects. All of those were incorporated into the budget last year. Some of them are still incorporated in Fund 41 now, but some of them were right out of fund balance, like the district-wide camera and building security system that was completed last year. To name one, the tennis courts was completed last year. So again, just a lot of money, and it totaled up to over $15 million with the work when we're all done. But it just skews the budget when you're comparing year over year. I left this slide in there because I think it's important to people to remember all that work that is being done, has been done and will be done. The vast majority came out of district reserves that we built up over the last few years. No debt was issued related to any of these projects, and no additional funding source was asked of our taxpayers in the school district. So pretty rare for the size and scope. And those projects are moving along. Probably the best one, easiest one to see is the bleachers at South. If you haven't driven by, it looks really nice over there. If you've been inside of North, it looks like we're reconstructing the building, and in a lot of ways we are above the ceiling grid. So a lot of work, and we will be done. I talked to Kyle today, so we're confident that we'll be ready for the start of the school year. Long-term debt. We've talked a lot about this, and we're going to talk about it a little more tonight as we hone in on what we want the tax picture to look like for the preliminary budget. As I mentioned, we do have some defeasance built in, and that's a call we can make in October. We need a number to present in September. And then we're on pace to probably pay off all of our debt or have the funds on hand to make the remaining payments in 7 years. Not 7 years from today, but 7 years from 2019 when we borrowed the first draw on the referendum. So it's our goal to have SDW be debt-free within the next few years, or no longer needing to levy in the next few years. And when you compare that to what other districts do with a 20-year repayment plan, it certainly makes SDW stand out, especially when you factor in we're one of the largest school districts in the state of Wisconsin. So in terms of scale, you would naturally think we'd have more debt, but that's not the case. This is just some levy averages, and now this is through last year, because I like to, when I show these stats, I prefer to have hard numbers and not what I think this year might be. Over the last 3 years, the average decline in levies been roughly 2.5%. Over the last 10 years, our average increase in the levies been 0.64%. Some people would think these numbers are great, some people would think they're not so great, but I don't think it's a bad story to share. Especially when you factor in the referendum and the security and everything we were able to bring and still maintain these numbers. I think it's pretty strong. Here is the preliminary budget by fund. This is on the opening pages of the budget document that's enclosed. As I said, a couple of funds have faded away. The other ones are steady, and I don't think any of these other ones will fall off anytime soon. For a total of $215 million in revenue and $223 million in expenditures. And again, that gap between total revenue and total expenditures is coming from Fund 41, where we're spending down the fund balance to finish paying off the Phase 3 capital improvement projects. The levy as drafted into this document, again, I think it's a conversation we need to have, calls for a 2.6% levy increase and a tax rate decrease of 13 cents. I think we need to focus on the levy tonight. To have a decreasing tax rate in this environment is not fiscal wizardry. With the percentages of rate increase or valuation increases everywhere, it's really, in my mind, a levy conversation, which like I said, the scenarios are in docs for you to look at, but those were really just benchmarks for you to consider. But with what makes this one, this levy approval or projection a little more interesting, and we've talked about these on several times. DPI on July 1 came out with their aid estimate, which showed a very strong number for us. I don't always use that number, but I usually don't vary too far from it. But when they follow it up with a letter saying you might want to be careful using this number because of the MPS's reporting issues and the corrections, I put in the executive summary our last October surprise. As of October 14th, I thought we were going to get a lot more aid, about $850,000. The aid certification came out the next day, and there was this adjustment that we had been given no heads up. So I don't know what's going on with MPS. Their reports that were due last September are still not in, is my understanding. And I don't believe they can report this September's numbers without knowing what last September's numbers are. And I'm also not sure that last year's adjustment really doesn't go back a year further. So it's hard to guesstimate what this could do. But my underlying thought is we're going to have a solid aid year. That's my thought, but I'm not overly confident, and I can't name that number. As we mentioned earlier, we have the defeasance level. The overall increase in aid statewide, there is an increase in aid, the pool of money that we all share. There's a lot of referendums, a lot of spending approvals out there statewide that impact shared costs across the state. We should be faring well in that as these referendums continue to roll forward on an aid, through an aid lens. The voucher program, again, we built in 15%. So we've used for this budget a 2% increase in aid to develop the levy that I just outlined a minute ago. So to summarize, we're requesting the approval of the 24-25 preliminary budget based on a preliminary tax levy of fill in the blank. What do we want that number to be? I've built a career on being very conservative in September and coming in lower in October. I think that's going to happen this year. But the inverse just causes questions in October. If you come in higher in October. So the tax scenarios are there. It doesn't have to be one of those either. You can tell me a percentage and I can easily calculate that. out and adjust the document for the budget hearing as well, so. A lot of information, but I thought I'd put it in a slide deck to kind of help frame all the moving parts that we have going on.
Is there any questions to start? Say who wants to go first? Mr. Wad?
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Clark, for pulling this presentation together. Very interesting information. I have a couple of questions on some assumptions you had built into your scenario. So you had indicated an estimate of a 15% increase in voucher transfers out, right? Is that right? Okay. And you said that matches sort of the historical average?
Historical's it actually has been a little higher, but
Okay.
my thought is that market's maturing.
That's kind of where I was going. I was starting to wonder if, so obviously, we had Mill Creek Academy open. I presume that pulled a fair number of students.
About 60, I believe. 70.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any new charter schools, at least coming up for this year. Do we know, are there still a lot of, when a charter school opens, right, does that continue to draw additional students in the grades that they've already established, or they tend to be fairly flat?
I don't know if we don't have a lot of data on who's out there. It's
Okay.
part of the problem, but my guess is that after a few years, they are what they are.
Right.
That you're just replacing the exiting kids.
Do we know, is Mill Creek adding a grade this year? Are they
My understanding
intending
is
to expand?
when they started, I think they were third grade was their maximum, and they're just following that grade up till at least sixth, seventh grade now. I would assume they've been around. I think they go through the middle school year.
Okay, all right.
In Montessori, back when we partnered with them, we had a similar arrangement where we followed the A grade through, kept adding.
Okay, but you did estimate it a little bit more conservatively than what we've seen the last couple of years, is that true?
I would think,
Okay,
yeah. It's hard to know. I mean, essentially,
Sure.
we're told the number.
sure.
That's about all the data we have.
And just to follow up on that, so does that also include open enrollment outs? Are those a part of your voucher estimates, or is it just the
No, it's
charter
separate.
and choice schools?
Yeah, unlike the vouchers where it runs through our revenue limit and levy, they're standalone revenues and expenses that come through a different transaction with DPI.
Okay,
So what I've done with them is left them pretty close to where they are. But with both of these, it's not always just the head count that's impacting, but it's also how much money per year per student.
right.
So even if you have the exact number of kids, the numbers can still inflate.
Do we anticipate a change in the amount that we'll need to transfer for this coming year, or is that set biennially?
Really-
So the dollars flow in and then back out.
Right.
Right, and there's a certain dollar amount assigned to a head count,
Yep.
right? So that number can increase, right,
Mm-hmm.
over time?
Yep.
I guess what I'm asking is, do we anticipate a higher amount per student this year than last year?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And do you know what the increase is on that, just off the top of your head?
I don't know
It's okay, I was just curious.
yeah, it's higher, the vouchers is higher than ours. I just don't remember what the percentage was.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any other questions? I wanted to tap in on a couple things. So when we take a look at last year, right, so these discussions that we have are shared with our community and whatnot, and one of the things that occurred last year is just really understanding where we are in the timeline of the budget as coming up with a levy and how that will change. Far more important for me right now is really understanding the DPI bogey that we have, because this, one way or another, this is going to be a benefit to the district. How big this is, we don't know. And it's a one-time event is what we're thinking if they can get MPS to get reconciled. I don't know how soon that will be to see if there will be one time or if it carries over into the next year. But that is something that outside of where we come up with a levy, that we should be also to some degree strategizing how that impacts us, how the funds work, where we're using it, how we're going to be touching that, because we are still, and this is where I'm starting to get back into coming in, we still have a structural deficit. Our expenditures exceed. And while we are taking a strong look at all of our costs to be able to manage them and figure out where we can start to rein our costs in on our normal operating expenditures, it is something that this will have an impact on and how we use it. So I just want us to be cognizant of that and how we plan to be able to assess, take a look at it, and in some cases, almost be strategic with any utilization that would put the district in a benefit going forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's it. And I should also add, let's say aid comes in at 12%, and we only budget 2 or 6 or whatever right now, there is no new revenue arriving. It's offset
Correct.
by the levy. So people and politicians will rush out to say, oh, we gave schools so much more money. It's just a matter of the source. Just, I know everyone in here understands that, but for people who may be watching it, it's not new money at that point, it's tax relief.
Correct. And it's a really good call out, but I mean, it still does impact as to where we're going. And
Oh,
that,
yeah.
and that's the part that I think we need to be really clear about. What does that mean for the operational pieces that we're doing?
No, I agree.
Mr. Wad?
Yeah, thank you. So I agree with a statement you made when you were on the slide that talked about what our average levy increase has been over the last, or decrease as it were, over the last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Do we have access to those numbers for other similarly sized districts or top 5 or 10 districts in the state that might help paint a better picture for folks who want to say, how does this stack up, right, with, say, Appleton or Eau Claire or Kenosha or somebody?
Yeah, I believe we can, because we have to report our amortization schedules to DPI, so I think that data is out there. You just have to do some data mining to get to that.
And I assume those numbers, if we were to look at like the last 5 years, right? If any of those districts have passed referendums that increase their levy authority, that's going to show up in those numbers, correct?
The bonded debt will, for sure.
Okay.
The referendum questions are out there. Well, you just have to, that'd be more of a manual process, I think, to get
Right.
to that. But the bonded debt would definitely be out there.
But in terms of the increase in the levy, right, the bottom line goes up when you increase your, right?
Yep.
Okay. I think that would be helpful if we could get that. I'd be very curious to see where we compare to other similar sized districts. And perhaps other districts in Waukesha County.
Yeah, I usually run it kind of the Classic 8 and the large districts, kind of get both sides of the conversation, I guess.
Sure. Thank you.
Dr. Piasek?
Thanks. So I have a hard time approving anything in a preliminary state, given the mess of state aid that we're dealing with, that would suggest either we're going to levy more from our local taxpayers or less without any competent basis of information. Because unfortunately, we have I think we have people in our local news circles who like to take an angle on things that either way is going to sound like somebody's up to something. And the reality is we don't know if these aid projections are going to hold or not, and we don't have any control over that. So I think what happened last year is we went with what we thought was a conservative estimate so that we wouldn't be disappointing anyone by having to increase the levy. And as a result, the messaging was, we planned to increase the levy, which was not true. We actually expected not to, and we didn't. But it caused a lot of confusion unnecessarily because we just don't have reliable data on the state aid side. So I know that this number is large, and I know we did see a pretty significant bogey last year where we didn't anticipate that that was going to hit us. But I think what we're looking at here in terms of what you put together, Darren, is the scenario B, which is pretty close to flat. I don't know why we would have any reason to say otherwise. And I would have been inclined last year to say, well, let's take scenario C and say that, well, it could go up a couple percent if these numbers from DPI are completely inaccurate, which they were last year. But we have no control over that data. So I have a hard time going with plus 2.5, just like I have a hard time going with minus 4.5. And I think, to your point, that it is ultimately tax relief, it's not new revenue. That would be nice to be able to deliver to our taxpayers, but we've also seen that there are these year-over-year corrections that happen, which is why we got hit last year. And it's so unpredictable. So I think people will start to see this, like I think it was 22, 23, where we had a pretty significant drop,
Yeah.
right?
The levy went down 10%.
All kinds of reasons,
Yep.
right? Property value, enrollment, referendum debt, all that stuff. And last year, I think we were proactive enough to try to work with some of that defeasance and make it so that it would have the least, dramatic impact to the taxpayers. The other variable in this is the school tax levy credit, which comes after the fact from the state perspective and has a little bit to do with equalized property values, but not a lot. So that's also somewhat unpredictable. So I guess my opinion here would be that in a preliminary sense, we approve a flat or the minus 0.24, the scenario B that you have, which I think is, it factors in a 50% error on the initial aid projection. And if we get more than a 50% error from DPI on this because of what's going on with MPS, we won't be the only district that is going to be looking for answers.
Yeah, and you can keep in mind the defeasance is still at play as well, so.
Right, so if it's plus or minus
There'll
40%.
be three
we can
moving
still
parts
work
at
with
that
it,
point, right? And I can't say that's wrong. Normally I come out with a kind of a strong recommendation, but for all the reasons you just stated, I could argue each of these. Maybe not the 12%, but other than that,
Rationally, it seems like we would be in a better position to start with the higher number and then work our way back, like, a 2% increase, which we don't think is going to happen, but, gives all kinds of room. But based on the experience that we had last year, I think that just, it's messaged inappropriately, and that's not our intent. And I think we're looking at pretty significant aid numbers. I don't know how to say that that's any more the right number than the complete opposite direction.
Mr. Munn?
Yeah, so just so I understand, that aid number is going to be dependent upon the September report that's currently outstanding. Is that true?
last September's report for MPS.
Right,
and-
which still hasn't been filed, right?
And then this year's aid is supposed to be based on this September's
Oh.
numbers, so,
So I guess where I'm going with this is, we're what, August 13th, 12th today? What if they don't file by the point that the state needs to make a determination about what our aid looks like?
yeah. My guess is they won't withhold aid, because the dollar amounts are, I can't imagine the amount of aid they get, but it's gotta be significant. The only fallback in my mind that they would have would be use budgeted numbers. Now, whether state statute allows for that, but that'd be the only data they would have on 23, 24 is what was their budget, what got adopted. I don't know what they used the prior year, because at first I thought they just filed the information that needed to be corrected. I'm getting the sense from what I hear on the radio or wherever, that they never filed. And I don't know if that's true, but they had to have used something. And the budgeted numbers is the only thing I can think of that would have been there for that, unless they just said freeze it, but I don't know what authority they'd have to make that random decision either.
Right, so I totally understand your reasoning, Dr. Piasek, and I think we do want to be in a position where we can say if we have to increase our levy, it's not going to be because we misbudgeted, but because of the mess we're seeing at MPS impacting what the aid will or won't be. But my concern is, how much could that number fluctuate if MPS still doesn't file the reports by the time?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to set it up that we're looking at a huge increase and then try to explain to our taxpayers that we didn't even see it coming and now they're having to take a hit of, I don't know, 12% is kind of your worst case scenario? Is that kind of-
12% is what DPI's estimate provided. 12.3, I think it was, or 12.1.
Which would result in a,
Significant levy decrease.
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at this, not the 12%, the 0%.
Yes, yep.
Which would result in a nearly 4% or over 4%. Mm-hmm. Okay.
For 1 year.
So I'm just wondering, I mean, I kind of like splitting the difference, but I also understand your point as well. I'm just not sure what.
Yeah, and again, it doesn't have to be one of these four. I was just trying to
Right.
give you benchmarks, I guess.
Well, I think that's, if I could, thank you. I think that's the reason for this statutory requirement for the preliminary budget is so that we can give the community an opportunity to look at it, understand it, and ask questions, and, come and talk to us about it. And yet, every scenario is really driven by what's going to happen with state aid. So we could pick any one of these and be wrong. And I think what Darren and the administration have recommended on like the most conservative estimate here, which would result in maybe a 4% change in the overall tax levy, is that the aid would be flat to what it was last year, which was also affected by a significant
$853,000,
last-minute
right?
change, right? So these are pretty big swings, and I just don't know that we have any control over it. And then, you start to wonder, what is the point of DPI putting out a preliminary aid estimate when it's unreliable, for the purpose of making these preliminary budgets, and then you can't hold to them anyway.
And they use our budgeted numbers to come up with that aid estimate in July. But you don't have the swing. I mean, normally it's been, okay, people spend around their complete budget and it has some validity to it, but I don't know. Well, they even came out with the statement saying, be cautious using this number, essentially.
So I guess
I-
that's where I'm at. Like, it's just, what's the right one? And they said last year we were deliberately more conservative in picking the bigger number, and it was communicated as though that was fully the intent, and it really was just, we're just trying to not shock everybody if those assumptions don't come through.
Yeah,
Sorry, Carrie.
I just looked up, last year at the budget hearing, we took a levy of 83.6 million. I don't have the percentage, but it must have been around 5. And then we finished with a $81.4 million.
So when I take a look at the experience of all the years that I'm building a budget, I've never built a budget for any company with a huge assumption out there that you can't control. If it came through, it was always an upside to the budget. You readjust your forecast as the year goes on and you change your estimates. But the piece for us, I'm far more concerned that we are building a budget that addresses a continuation of declining enrollment, an increase in vouchers. What does that mean for revenue, and what does that mean for the hard look at what our operating costs are to run this district? And are we addressing those needs and making the correct adjustments to be able to take a look at what we do know? Here's how much revenue I am expecting, here's the cost that it takes to do that. We have to make adjustments on that, and that's where we should be looking and figuring out, here's what we're at, here's what our deficit is. Do we need to tap on the community, which I don't think we should or we need to? I think that that big look on the strategic plan that we're working on, which is really the deep dive into the costs that we are using to run this district and making sure that we are doing all that we can to cut costs to be able to right-size the district, knowing that we are losing enrollment, we're watching voucher programs increase, and going from there. What happens then with DPI and MPS figuring this all out, this is gonna be a 1 year, possibly 2 swing. That has truly nothing to do with us managing the operations of this district. And so our budget should reflect that. So I mean, and I think that's where Dr. Piasek is, but I would not put in a budget some unknown variable, and we've always used it as an upside downside because I can't predict it. I mean, we're not a for-profit company either, so I'm not trying to build stretch into being able to grow this. But we do have to have a realistic look at what the operational costs are. Dr. Piasek?
The one thing I can tell you is, I know our revenue limit's gonna come in at about $136 million because of the declining enrollment exemptions. So we know the dollars, we just don't know in what form it's coming. So in terms of knowing where we are, just revenues to expenditures, I have that comfort. It's the political side of being a school district where they get a mailing every December with a number on it, and people either don't pay attention to it or don't like it. And the inability of us to be able to tell them what that's gonna be is an incredibly odd thing when we're already 2 months into our fiscal year. And by the time the final number, we're 4 months into our fiscal year. So, yeah, and these adjustments that we're talking about, there's always been small aid adjustments, but it's normally 1 or 2 kids got counted and they actually went to Sussex, or, you know, you're talking $20,000, $30,000 adjustments on a $136 million revenue limit calculation. We never talked about it but that's not where we are.
I agree with you. I think if we were just to hold state aid at where it came in last year, right, we still have no guarantee that that's what the number's going to be. And I think based on what we can anticipate, we think it's going to be higher. But I also think that if we were to go with that scenario where there's no increase on state aid, that we as a board would probably look to the only other lever that we have control over, which is the referendum defeasance. And so that's why I would struggle with going with that scenario flat out at 4% up, because I don't see us not taking some sort of leverage with the defeasance if we get completely stuck with a flat state aid estimate. Because I think our goal, well, at least my goal, is to try to minimize the impact for the taxpayers so that it's not like we're hitting hard 1 year and then,
And I go back to what I said when we started this conference. There's a lot of things telling me we could have a really good aid year. I mean, first of all, the DPI estimate, they had to factor in something from MPS. It's not like they just put 0 next to MPS. So I think the flat, the only reason I shared flat with these scenarios is a true data point, right? But I don't know if we'd have to go to that extent either. That's why I didn't incorporate. I mean, that'd be the ultimate one to make me look really smart if aid came in, is to push that one. And I don't think that's a fair number to put in here. And I could be completely wrong, so.
So to Dr. Piasek's point, because it's spot on, that's what we should be managing, right? Here's the bucket of knowns that we have, and here's what we can control. We don't have a scenario here that shows hey, if we played with defeasance, here's how that would look, correct?
No, that's why I think this is a conversation of what percent change in levy do you want? Because I could be playing with aid and defeasances, and I could literally have ran 50 scenarios here. They're quick, I can run them if you give me the target you want to hit. But I just think it simplifies the conversation to say, what kind of levy, how conservative do you want to be with the levy?
Well, I think we're a conservative board, so we'd always lean to be more conservative than not.
Your enrollment estimate is down 200, you said? What was in the?
2% on the 3-year average is 184 kids. And if you look at,
We were off a bit last year, right? We were about a percentage or a percentage and a half off.
I can't remember what we baked into last year's budget, but yeah, one and a half maybe. I could calculate the number, but you can see with that 2% drop, if you have the tax scenario sheet, you can see that declining enrollment exemption goes up. So for that first year, that's why I can tell you what the revenue limit is going to be with a pretty high level of accuracy. But then that exemption goes away, and it's replaced by a new exemption, and you can see the jump.
Well, Mr. Rudd?
I was just gonna say, so it sounds like perhaps what we might want to be suggesting is, rather than trying to pick one of these scenarios, although, I mean, I think we could find something close to it, what we want to identify is what's the levy increase, decrease target we're attempting to hit, right? So if there is any difference from that, I mean, it's saying the same thing you said, just maybe a twist to it. So instead of saying let's target what we think the aid is going to look like, let's target what we want the final levy to be, and then that might be one lever or one tool that we have at our disposal to keep it there, which would be a difference or increase in the amount of aid from it being flat, or the defeasance tool, or I don't know if there are other tools that we can look at in the toolbox besides those two. Those are the obvious ones. But do we want to instead just tell or provide guidance to say, let's set our target for a 0% levy increase?
Dr. Piasek?
I think the only other lever we have is the per pupil max, right? And I think we're facing some increased costs across the board. That's real. We're also facing declining enrollment across the board, which is real, and I think we're talking about all the right things. So we've got our defeasance, we've got our per pupil, and then we have this variable that is somewhat out of our control. It's maybe a coincidence that the flexibility we have on the defeasance is actually on par with the state aid, the difference in the aid estimate. So if we swing one way on aid, we could maybe make that up on the other side. I don't know what the right number is, but as a taxpayer, I think when my taxes go up on average more than 2%, I probably notice. I think we should be in a position to be reasonably flat if everything comes in the way we expect it to be, if not better than that. But if we're not comfortable with that because we don't have reliable numbers, I think the challenge is we have to approve the preliminary budget book and
Levy.
the levy.
percent, Yep.
And when we look at these scenarios, it's not exactly what I think we've been talking about here tonight, which is if we're off a little bit on aid, we potentially could make that up with the only other two levers we have. And we know that the cost to educate students is going up, but then we have this debt hanging out there that we could lean on if we had to.
I think I'm just trying to get my arms around it, to me, what seems to be a little bit backwards, which is give me a number, and I'm saying we have a district to run that has known pieces of revenue and costs and where there's that. So it's the onus on us is to manage the costs so that we can keep that in there. So number one, we're not asking the taxpayers to increase so that we're running the district. But the other piece is, yes, to the discussion, I also don't want to say, I mean, we should be doing everything in our power to make sure that we're not asking for more and that we are keeping things flat. The question is what does that look like and how do we do that? Because I don't want to get to a point where we know that we have the known items to control, even with the defeasance, but that doesn't get us all there. So the risk for me is trying to come up with a number that I can't say, is this going to get us what we need so that we run this district? So yes, I don't want to burden and I want to keep the tax levy flat. We've got a couple tools that we can use once all of, the numbers come together. But we should be, in my head, I guess, a little bit more able to be strategic to say, here's what that levy percent is to keep us here. And if we did, and the wiggle room that you have is here, that makes it easier versus saying, I feel like we're being asked to pick a number out of a hat, and I'm just not comfortable. That's not how I work. I can't, so my brain struggles with that part a little bit. But I do agree, and I think based on the numbers that we saw with the defeasance last year on how that did change the levy, I think there's enough support there to say, assume and keep the DPI analysis out because we don't have any understanding of it. This is what that would look like, and here's how we would plan that for our district. So the goal, keep us flat. Here's win, fall with the defeasance and what we can control, and then go from there. But I'm kind of rambling out loud for a little bit because I have a hard time just trying to pick a number.
Question, do we have the entire 7 million of that defeasance to be flexible with, or does there have to be something there?
No, the scheduled levy for, if we were just following the amortization schedule, was like $6.2 million. So the actual defeasance amount's 810,000, I think it was.
Okay,
Right.
so I figured,
And I just kept that flat,
right,
take at least one variable out of all this.
right, not as much flexibility as I thought. But that's fine, that's why I asked.
So
And come October, we'll be able to fine tune this thing, I mean, so nicely that,
Yeah, and then in the meantime, right, it's approved when we know how the noise goes, and I think that's what we're trying to prevent is,
Right.
I don't want to get to a separate place that we're coming into this saying we're going to keep it flat because that's our intent, and then we can't control what we can control to make sure that we are keeping it flat. That's the risk that we have.
exactly.
So I think we're all here that we want to keep things flat. So what that number is to keep it flat. Dr. Piasek?
Okay.
I think that number, maybe there's a compromise between scenarios B and C. If there's a 4% change in increase in aid, which maybe that's a little bit more conservative. And then I think what we're looking at is a
About 1.4-ish?
1.4, 1.5. Yeah, which would be a mill rate closer to like 5.4-ish. Which is irrelevant. The mill rate's meaningless. Everybody knows that. But I don't know if that just helps anybody. You know, I think we're all struggling with, there's this flat scenario, and then there's this more conservative scenario, but it still has an increase in aid, which we think is reasonable. We just don't know how big that increase is going to be. It gets us at a, like I said, 1.4-ish. Would be like,
Again, I can hit any
the
number.
worst case scenario. I mean, it's not the worst case scenario. It's the 1 sigma. Sigma, sorry. Sigma. 1 sigma.
We can do
I think that makes sense.
2.5, version 2.5, or B minus, or however you want to look at
I'm
it.
just looking for a compromise, but it wouldn't really change, it wouldn't change anything, although I do think that if we landed in that scenario, we would probably take some
Defeasance.
defeasance, and then we'd probably get as close back to even as we could, or at least less than 1%. I feel like less than 1% is fair.
So any percentage less than 1%? Is that where we're ending up, or just the midpoint?
Well, I mean, we'd get a preliminary, if we didn't do anything with the defeasance, we'd get, I'm trying to do this math in my head, but 2.95.
Or to take the
Actually,
810,000?
1.2, I think, 1.2% maybe. Am I doing that right? You have the live spreadsheet, I don't, but,
Right, that's,
so if we went to a 4% aid increase, we'd be at 1.2%, and if we could take
Back off
maybe a
on the
little bit out of
defeasance.
defeasance to get to 1%, I think that's a reasonable starting point, maybe. I don't know what you guys think, but I'm just trying to compromise between those two plans.
Yeah, I can,
Any one of these is as good as the other one.
like I said, we could have ran 1,000 of these scenarios.
If,
yep, Mr.
okay.
Ron.
I think if we can communicate to our taxpayers that our intended goal is to keep their potential increase in the school portion of the property taxes to 1% or less, I think that is a message that would be, particularly given all the other things that we know about the increase in cost to the district and the declining revenues we're getting. I think that is a worthy target that I would hope our taxpayers would appreciate.
Agree. I agree.
All right, then we'll move ahead with a 1% scenario.
So with that, then I'd be looking for a motion.
A motion to approve the preliminary budget with a 1% tax levy increase. Unless you want it to be 0.9.
Can I just clarify, though, that then the preliminary budget book would reflect a 2%, a 4% increase in aid,
Yep.
and
then whatever
the
it takes.
accordingly adjustment in defeasance to get to 1%.
Say it was coming.
Yep.
It was coming out to 1.2, just the way it is now, but we're going to adjust somewhere else as well. Okay,
That'll get us down to 1.
to 1%, okay.
So we're going to obviously look at this as a whole board on Wednesday again, so if there's
Yeah, we'll update the book.
mathematically that doesn't work out in that, you're going
It
to tell us.
should, though, but yeah, I'll bring it.
I think we
We'll
did.
just take, out of a budget of 10,000 account numbers, we're talking 3 account numbers that need to be tweaked, so.
Okay. Do you want to make the motion?
Move to approve the preliminary budget book and tax levy as presented with a 1% levy increase
Okay.
and modifications as discussed.
I'll second that.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Passes 5-0, Mr. Clerk.
Excellent.
Okay. Ready to move on?
Mm-hmm.
Moving on to the discussion or information items, the next item is the monthly budget report.
Heather has put together or inserted all of the normal health, dental claims, payable information, tax levy report, et cetera. In terms of last year's, well, this year's budget, we're so new into it. Everything looks fantastic at this point because all we're paying is summer school, basically. But just to update you on last year's budget, preliminary work for the audit was done, field work was done last week, so we're actually, well, I guess field work's still going on this week, even though no one's here, it's all virtual now. And everything seems to be going along smoothly. So we thought with the conversation we just had that we had enough budget conversations, but in terms of how 23, 24 is closing out, it's coming in, I think, pretty close to budget. But keep in mind, when you see those numbers, because of phase 3 of those capital improvement projects, we approved a budget that was, I believe, $8.2 million in the hole for Fund 10 by design. And we're coming in, I think, about $1 million short of that deficit. So I think a pretty strong outcome.
Any questions or discussion? Okay, seeing none, the next discussion item is the key performance indicators.
Just 1 second here. Come on. Kind of locked up here. Do you have it? Yeah, if you can. I'm just stuck here. It's not letting me open Keynote. So if you want to bring it up, that'd be great. Yeah. We're partnering in this.
We are, go team. Tonight, we are bringing forward the key performance indicator in this area, and we just wanted to share that we've been working as a cabinet team to look at all key performance indicators that we've had in our district. It's been a good time to reflect on what information we have for the key performance indicators and share if there's any updates or new data, and then also be able to share any recommendations moving forward. Each of you have the key performance indicator packet that is also available online. We've been sharing this at each committee meeting as well. So these are the ones that we'll be talking about tonight, going through the current KPIs for this area. For our KPIs, we have specific areas, so teaching and learning, student services, or student engagement and parent satisfaction. Both of those areas were discussed at our last committee meeting for discussion, and then moving forward, possible more discussion and possible action in the future. The HR committee will look at employee satisfaction engagement, and tonight we'll look at operations and finance. Then I'll just move it down to the actual finance part, and that's where we're just trying to kick it off together, just having a common approach to all of our KPIs as a system. So let me just get to this.
So when the original KPIs were approved, there was 4 of them that were agreed upon. 2 of them are tied directly to board policy. One was the 15% fund balance threshold, that we would work to maintain that. And then we went with strong debt management and policy 6147. One thing that I liked about that policy, because at the time we were looking for how do we get a measure that we're doing a good job. And the strong debt management policy talked about stability and audits and all those things. So that's why that one was kind of more of an umbrella policy. But a lot of the things we would talk about was in that 6147. The next slide has the 2.5% of operational budget to go into the maintenance program. One thing I like about that one is it's very measurable, and we defined that in the key performance indicator. and that's 2.5% of Fund 10 expenditures that we would levy into Fund 41. And then KPI number 4 was 75% of our operational budget would be used for district staffing, which is between 75 and 80% is kind of I guess, the industry standard. So I've been giving it some thought on how to go about doing this. And one thing I noticed, and I looked at other districts, and I shared some links to other school districts that you can, at your leisure, take a look at, is there's a whole list of things in mine, as Jen and I were talking about it today, my KPIs are very measurable. There's a financial statement, there's a levy, there's set things in stone that are hard and true over time. But all of them, in my mind, have to do with just financial management and the guidance. So I think rather than having those first 2 KPI and maybe even the third one, that we have one umbrella financial operation KPI, and I'll touch on that in a little more detail in the next slide. KPI number 3, again, I like the measurability of it. I love the intent of it, that we see maintaining facilities as one of our core missions as well. The 4th KPI, and actually any of them that are a percentage of our operational budget, you're chasing a number and then not, heaven forbid, something like ESSER comes along again, but all of a sudden all this new revenue and expenditures come in, and all of a sudden 2.5% of my Fund 10 operation will just balloon by $10 million. So I don't know. That's the downside of KPI number 4. So if you want to forward. So what I was thinking, and this goes back to some verbiage that's in policy 6174, is that we create more of a umbrella KPI for financial. And a lot of the districts I looked at had this report card, and I started thinking, am I even a KPI or am I a financial report card? Is it completely just a separate conversation? And I think it still could be. In strategic plans, though, they still speak to the things that we've talked about: audit, bond rating, those types of things. But I kept going back to the language in the debt management policy. In the first 2 bullets, I believe it was the first 2 or 2 out of the first 3, was just fiscal stability and public trust. And is that kind of what all these reports and all these things that often are listed as separate KPIs is? And is it like a report card underneath with all of these separate things? This is not meant to be a final draft in any point, but the audit, keeping fund balance, long-range planning, whether it's facilities or fiscal. We had a long conversation about levy and reducing costs. Is it just one thing, or is it just a financial report card that, yep, we checked all these boxes? Or you could list a bunch of these separately, but I'm not sure that's necessary. I'm going to forward it one more time, Jen. Jen? Oh,
Sorry.
Sorry. Again, I like this old KPI or current KPI number 3 because I think it's very measurable. It forces us to hit that target or get very close to it. It also could fit into that more umbrella type KPI under long range planning, in my mind, that unless you know what your funding is going to be, it's hard to come up with a plan. Like I said, it's easy to calculate, and you know right away whether you've hit it or not. When we're
Got it.
and I would eliminate the 75% threshold. That's the industry standard, but I don't know if we need to hit that number. It could be 85, it could be 65. What's technology going to do for us in 5 years? And so to tie me to a number that really, I've never seen proof that if you spend 75% of your budget on people, that you're going to have the best instructional program in the world. I don't think that data exists. I just think this is what everyone does. And again, when you add things like ESSER and things like that, the percentage is moving. And it does say average of 75%, but I don't know if this is a KPI that I would recommend keeping. But
Yeah, so just a thought on that. I don't know, just thinking out loud a little bit here. One of the things we found ourselves talking about recently is where, where do our staff and benefit costs fall relative to other districts of our size in the state? I mean, I would think we might want to look to, and I don't know if a KPI is appropriate for this or not, but trying to figure out how we ensure that we're competitive, but responsible in our salaries and benefits to ensure we can continue to attract good talent, but so as not to exceed or be too lavish at the taxpayer's expense. I don't know, maybe that's more of an HR target, but when we're talking about a percent of operational budget to personnel costs, I think that is kind of in the same neighborhood, right? I don't know.
So I would have I would have an agreement that I think it needs to be incorporated and probably within employee satisfaction and engagement, where we're starting to talk about where we are within the market. From a finance standpoint, everything that I've ever built on has been having KPIs that surround about an audit. I mean, getting a healthy audit is what I use for every benchmark to say, are we doing what we need fiscally to be smart? So an audit should be an absolute. The other part that I really liked, and if we take a look at the Oshkosh, it's where we start to talk about the capital plan. This is far more the strategic plan. This is everything we started to talk about prior that includes not only the long-range plan on facility management, but just overall outlook on operational cost and infrastructure as to what are we doing to be able to manage our costs aside from staffing. But are we looking at the purchasing? Are we taking a look at what we're spending on? Are we pulling back where we should be? Because as we've seen, there's stuff that just, once it's in the loop and it's funded, it's perpetually funded. And we're at a point now that we need to stop the perpetual funding. And I think having a big strategic plan that talks about the 5-year, 7-year, 10-year, 10-year is extremely hard, but having that piece out there that really leverages us. Here's what we're doing. Here's how we're maintaining our facilities. We are budgeting for the facilities the same way that we're budgeting for teaching and learning curriculum. That's part of this too, is what are we doing to make sure that we're investing and monitoring going forward? Well, I can't predict, but I don't think we're going to get another ESSER where we're going to get the ability to do all of the great things that we've been able to do for our facilities without being thoughtful about the budget now. And when we're already running at a structural deficit, it makes that concept. So for me, I agree, Darren, that I would eliminate that one. I think that can move to someplace else in a format that when we're talking about staffing and personnel costs, there's a lot to that. I want to be competitive. I want to be market savvy. I want our staff to be engaged and all of that. But is that the finance operational piece? I don't necessarily think so. So that would pull that out of this area. I think finance has far too many KPIs. I think it's hard to manage and figure out what makes sense. The bond rating, I think I talked about this the last time. I'm not a fan of the bond. We don't have debt. It's great. I don't plan to be going for a referendum anytime soon. Is it great? Yes, but does that really say, I don't know. I've had people that disputed me on that one. So I just, like the bond one, I could give or take. I think what we're doing in terms of an audit, what we're doing in terms of being a strategic plan are probably the two most critical pieces as to how are we preparing for what we know is coming. And within the strategic plan, I like how you said that there is a percentage of investment, right? So we are budgeting and building into that plan. This amount of investment is going to cover our maintenance and all of the things that are coming up that we can. I was relatively long-winded, sorry. Mr. Zenobia.
Thank you. I would agree. There is a lot here, and I think some of these have already, a lot of the capital stuff, it's going to be completed at some point. I think when the public looks at this is a lot of great information, but it probably is a little bit overwhelming. And I don't know how much of it is necessary going forward. I would say a few pieces. Obviously, taxation, we just had the conversation of saying, hey, this is where we're at in relation to not only bigger districts, but just the area districts. It is important. I would, a couple of measures, I mean, I kind of like the bond rating. I think it just goes to the amount of work that's been put into our finance for a long time, even the last few years going through ESSER and the money that was spent elsewhere that was extra. Financially speaking, we've been good stewards of that money, and I think this shows that very well, and I think it's very important that the public understands, where the board sits on, bringing this to their attention and what we're doing to continue it. I do think it could be less. I think the taxation piece is important, and just some of the basics of where the district has been headed financially and continues to head financially. I think everyone knows I'm a big fan of KPIs, but as you all mentioned, this is the financial ones are easy to quantify, whereas in other areas they're not always so much. But I think an abbreviated version of this going forward would be great.
Dr. Piasek?
Thank you. I've said this in other committees. So when we're talking about KPIs, we're not talking about metrics. It's not just do stuff, do more, or anything that we can measure. So I think a lot of the benchmarks we talked about with other districts are important. I think those are department level, performance level things that don't need to be KPIs. So there's one or two things that really is the barometer in terms of how we judge that we're doing things right or we're moving in the right direction. So Ms. Kozlowski said earlier, we're constantly chasing structural deficit because enrollment is declining. And we're a large district that anticipates a lot of declining enrollment. So I think managing that structural deficit is really important. And I think, to me, that would be one of the most important things. And to what Mr. Zenobia said is balancing that with, we need to invest in our students by having the right resources and having the best staff and having, the right facility mix, but not doing that where I've watched a lot of other districts talk themselves into operating referendum after operating referendum because they're chasing a $500,000 structural deficit. So I think that managing that structural deficit with declining enrollment and balancing out the burden to the taxpayers and how we do that is the most important thing. With that, it's not a KPI, but I do love what we're doing with the maintenance piece. And I think you're also doing that with the curriculum piece, which I would consider a maintenance piece, right? We benefited from some resources with ESSER that we could put into some pretty high-end curriculum, even pretty high-end, but reliable and consistent curriculum. So I think those two things, they're both maintenance to me, that we're saving. And we're saving while we're managing a structural deficit, because most districts are going to run to an operating referendum and not save. So I think that balance of what's our savings as a function of the structural deficit that we're managing, and I think that kind of gets to the end, right? If we're doing a good job with our audits, and if we're compliant, and if we're transparent and reasonable, then I think all these other things are department metrics.
Agreed.
So can I ask a question?
You may.
What funds are we able to carry over? Like what are the funds that we can save into?
Well, we can leave it in Fund 10, right, where the vast majority is. Fund 27 has to be zeroed out. Fund 39, you can put dollars and save and roll it, but it has to be tied to the payment of debt. You can't use it for whatever other purpose. Fund 41 for long-term maintenance, we can do that. The budget the last 5 years, I believe, does a $500,000 transfer into Fund 46 for long-term maintenance. That those dollars can roll. Our property sales fund rolls. The food service fund rolls with some input from DPI every so often because they want like a cap on your fund balance. And then the community service, it can, but we generally levy and keep that very tight. But most of these things you can roll the money, but it's tied to a Fund 10 is the only one where you had complete latitude to use the money for whatever you'd like.
So Fund 10, if I'm not mistaken, that would be where we would save anything for anticipated curricular updates.
Yeah, actually, Jen and I have had that conversation of she has her adoption wish list or timeline that she'd like to see happen, and I think we've talked about it in this committee even about coming to year end. Now, this obviously when we ran a sizable deficit planned, but the kind of the theory was half of our year end dollars could go into this curriculum adoption fund, and we would just designate that within Fund 10 fund balance. Just like we designate for health insurance, premiums and all the same. It would just be its own category. And we could do that designation. You don't need a year-end surplus. You could designate existing fund balance for that purpose. The nice thing is it still helps us out cash flow wise. It's still there. It's just, it's the expenditure part of it that you're putting some restriction on. Which a board can undo as well, so.
No, I think that makes sense, and I think that's what we would be looking at.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. If we can point to specific savings as a percentage of expenditures for things like facility, curriculum, those things that aren't annual recurring, but we know they're coming. That gives us the flexibility to then take some bigger swings with fund balance when we have something that we really want to do. I think that reflects healthy planning and balancing, and then I think the audit piece, which is your wheelhouse, but I think we have to consistently be A+.
Yep.
No, we can bring that back in the final budget adoption, or it can be a standalone agenda item as well. We could do that at any time. So Jen and I will meet and kind of look at what she's looking at going out, because with Esther going away, we don't have $1 million textbook budget sitting there. It doesn't exist, and it hasn't existed for many years. So, but luckily we have a big jump start on our costs. So.
We do. I would just add that we're also having conversations within the teaching and learning department too about looking at that long-range timeline. Like right now, we do a lot of it is by level. So whether it's middle school or high school or elementary in one subject area. So just considering how effective and efficient, that is. Do we need to consider, like, in a perfect world with no state changes or curriculum changes as far as like standards that are required, could we, every 5 years have it be math and music or something? And then we look at K-12, the complete alignment at that time versus elementary math at this time, middle school math. That's just one idea, but we're just trying to be really open and creative and flexible and planning for the future.
Oh, I think that's great. And I mean, all honesty, I think this is what household budgets do, right? I mean, we have a savings account for taxes, for Christmas, for, I have a boatload of them. But I think we need to, and I think that's part of what districts hadn't done. Everybody had a general fund that was X percent of what per requirements for statutes or your policy. But now being specific about it so we know what's there. And I think what's interesting about Fund 10 is that even if we say 15%, we have to be careful that 15% at the point you have to withdraw. You can't pull yourself to withdraw less than 15%. So it's understanding how it's built up, how it's reserved, and then monitored, and then to be able to report on it at the end of every year that says, from a strategic plan, here's how much we have saved in Fund 41, 47, to say for the facilities, here's what we have for curricular needs, here's what we have for, and then the rest of it becomes kind of the unknown. We can't predict it all. But I think that part alone has been missing for a long time.
Yeah, and it all goes, like you mentioned earlier, it all goes back to our audit. Our audit breaks out. We have some reserved for OPEB obligations, we have some for health claims, and that would just be another line item in our financials that anyone could see on our financial statements on our website. So, but no, Jen and I will come back with some thoughts on this to start framing this conversation, because I do think it's a good idea, and I agree with you. This isn't what districts generally do.
Right.
The willingness to spend fund balances, which I've fought for not doing that for years, but I do think there comes a time when it is advantageous to do it, so.
Other questions? Okay. That is our last discussion item. Moving into other business, is there any recommendations for future committee meetings? Okay, seeing none, we do have a need to adjourn to executive session pursuant to Wisconsin statutes 19.85, parent 1, parent E, for deliberating or negotiating the purchasing of public properties, the investing of public funds, or conducting other specified public business whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require closed session. Looking for a motion.
So moved.
Second.